So I think we'll go ahead and start. It's after 12 and we do have a hard 1:30 end time. So we're here today to talk about wastewater and planning and where we are and where we hope to go to. We had a meeting of the Board of Selectmen probably 2 months ago, and they requested that we set up sort of an information session, so that's why we're here today. We have members of the Board of Health, we have the town administrator, members of the Board of Selectmen, and some folks from the Shellfish Advisory Committee. And up at the table, we have Aaron Perry from the Cape Cod Commission, Andrew Gottlieb from APCC, Brian Dudley from DEP, Drew, I'm sorry, I don't know your last name.
Osei.
O-S-E-I.
Osei. From Mass DEP as well, Scott Horsley and Kurt Felix. So I thought we would get started with Aaron, who could give us a rundown on the 208 plan and what that is and what it is not.
Sure. So the 208 plan was completed by the Cape Cod Commission. The state directed the commission to update the 208 plan. The region had one from 1978 that focused mostly on drinking water, but that definitely identified the use of septic systems and the reliance on septic systems as an issue that we would deal with moving forward. So the state directed us to update that plan in 2013. We worked with stakeholders across the region, including town officials, boards and committees, and elected officials, as well as other stakeholders from the business community, real estate, nonprofits, and others to update the plan. And what this plan really is, it was completed in 2015, is a framework through which local planning can be done. What we sought to do when we started the planning process was to identify what some of the barriers were that communities were facing as they were seeking to identify and develop plans and solutions to reduce nitrogen from septic systems and improve water quality in coastal embayments. And so the plan was really focused on identifying those barriers and looking for solutions to address them and help the communities, local communities, move forward and develop plans for their individual embayment watersheds. So the 208 plan, through certification and approval by Mass DEP and the governor of Massachusetts, and then approval by EPA, identified each of the 15 towns as waste treatment management agencies. So that's a term straight from the Clean Water Act. And essentially what it means is that each of the communities as these waste treatment management agencies are responsible for identifying and developing and implementing plans for their communities to address nitrogen from wastewater. So we're in the implementation phase right now. Many communities are looking to develop new plans and improve upon and implement the existing plans that were in place when we began development of the 208 plan. So you are similar to many other areas in the region. I guess the other thing I'll hit on a couple of the things that the 208 plan tried to do. One was that it sought to kind of change the jurisdiction around which communities plan. So in the past, communities had really developed town-wide wastewater management plans. It changed that jurisdiction, and we really tried to focus communities at looking at the watershed. The watershed is kind of the basis in which the problem exists, and so each watershed has a different extent of concerns and different extent of impairment from nitrogen. And so looking at the watershed basis, in addition, 32 of the watersheds, we have 53 total in the region. 32 are shared by more than one community. So in most communities, a town-wide plan won't address all of the issues in any given watershed. The other, one of the key kind of barriers that the 208 plan sought to alleviate is the use of a range of technologies. And so working with state and federal agencies, as well as stakeholders, we tried to identify the solutions and strategies that communities were interested in testing and evaluating in terms of their effectiveness to reduce nitrogen in the watershed. And so it expanded the community's ability to really look at some of those non-traditional approaches, those approaches that address nitrogen in the water body, those that address it within the groundwater, and then those that are source reduction in nature. So things like, collection and treatment in terms of source reduction or innovative alternative systems. So it expanded the types of technologies that communities could consider. Is there?
I think that's good. We're gonna hold on questions till everyone's done speaking, so that's good. And I'm gonna introduce Millie Garcia Serrano, who just walked in. She is the Regional Director of the Southeast DEP.
Hi there. Good afternoon.
So I don't know if Brian wants to speak or Millie, you would like to
Sure,
speak?
well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting us here. Clearly, this is, I believe, a wonderful opportunity for us to start the community engagement process with regards to dealing with nitrogen issues in Wellfleet. We are very excited to work with your community. Our first watershed permit was actually issued, I want to say a couple years ago now, with the Pleasant Bay through the Pleasant Bay Watershed Association. So you would probably be the second community to be issued that type of permit if that's something that the community wishes to enter into. There are some good advantages with regards to participating in a watershed permit process, mainly basically just working in a very concentrated approach and mode. So we can actually every month attempt to get together, iron out any kind of issues that are in the way of getting to a full-fledged plan that is compliant with state and federal law. Some of the good news also involve nitrogen crediting, which Brian Dudley will be able to talk about a little bit more, in addition to enforcement forbearance. So there are a lot of good opportunities, and we're very excited to be part of your community. We thank you this afternoon for allowing us to be here and exchange notes and take stock of what the community needs in order to move forward any kind of wastewater planning. Thank you.
Brian?
Okay. Well, thank you for having us here. We had met in a smaller group, I think back in February or March, to sort of discuss where Wellfleet was and where Wellfleet could go with regard to looking at nitrogen management and wastewater management. You had completed a draft screening of alternatives, an evaluation of alternatives back in 2014. But subsequent to that, in 2016, the Massachusetts Estuary Project had come out with the evaluation and analysis of Wellfleet Harbor, which basically identified the degree of impairment and looked at an array of nitrogen reduction strategies within the sub-embayments that would be able to meet the target thresholds that have been established for the embayment in order to restore water and habitat quality in the system itself. So, the efforts that you had done in 2014 certainly laid a very good baseline. But now with the additional information from the MEP, I think the town would be able to be a little bit more focused in its evaluation of strategies to meet the target threshold and, as I said, restore habitat quality. One of the things that we have looked at is the ongoing efforts that the community has engaged in with respect to shellfish. But at the same time, we also caution that while that may be a part of any overall strategy, it really likely is not going to be the only part of an overall strategy. And as Millie had referenced with the watershed permit, we piloted that with the Pleasant Bay Alliance for the communities of Brewster, Chatham, Harwich, and Orleans. And in doing so, we were able to set out a time frame for evaluation of alternative strategies, whatever they may be, along with the understanding that there would be a contingency plan comprised of traditional and proven technologies that would be a backup in the event that some of these alternative approaches do not meet expectations or result in the benefits that may be anticipated. And I would stress that's a contingency plan. It is not a requirement that you engage in construction of conventional approaches, but rather it's an insurance policy that in the event that these alternative approaches do not work, we will have something in our back pocket that will be able to meet the thresholds. So a lot of that is going to build on the work that has already been done. And I think what we're hoping to do, probably not finalize it today, but in subsequent meetings and consultation and coordination with the town, is figure out exactly what the scope of work should be in order to complete a targeted watershed management plan that will serve as the basis for a watershed permit that will allow you to get credit for these alternative approaches and will allow for any sort of enforcement forbearance for not meeting water quality standards. And it's not that we're coming out here with any sort of, threat to bear down on enforcement, but as I'm sure you're aware, there are other outside forces that not only are putting pressure on the towns, but are putting some pressure on us as well. And we want to make sure that we are moving forward in order to stave off any of those particular challenges.
Brian, can I just ask that you explain the difference between the targeted watershed management plan and a comprehensive wastewater management plan, just so that it's clear to all of
Yeah.
us?
They're basically the same thing, it's just the focus is different. As Aaron mentioned, we're looking at trying to address watersheds specifically, as opposed to an entire community plan, which different areas of a community may have different needs. Now, in this particular instance, because the main system that we're involved in and primarily encompasses the vast majority of Wellfleet, there really probably isn't going to be much difference, and that you would be doing one plan to address Wellfleet Harbor, which in turn would also pretty much cover the entire town, as opposed to say Yarmouth, for example, that is dealing with Lewis Bay, is dealing with Parker's River, is dealing with Bass River. They would be looking at targeted watershed management plans for each one of those watersheds. So I hope that answers the question.
And then Kurt, if you could give an update on where we are, you and Scott Horsley could all team together, or you want to talk about it?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say something briefly. We've been Wellfleet, I think, has taken a leadership role in some of the alternative strategies that have ultimately become part of the 208 process. We did pilot an oyster restoration site off near the town pier, got great results with substantial nitrogen reductions for that project, and then engaged in a process of trying to figure out how we could implement something like that in the town of Wellfleet, and ultimately got the Board of Selectmen and the Shellfish Advisory Board to approve an area management strategy that would include, 5 different locations for enhanced oyster production and productivity. And in addition to that, we've been engaged in not just oysters, but a variety of alternatives that include getting credit for anything that happens with the Herring River project. A Mayo Creek project was initiated based on some initial work that the Wastewater Committee did, and ultimately, encouraged a committee to get formed to look at the potential for some restoration in that area. So we've looked at a variety of different alternatives, including satellite cluster systems. So the range of things that the town of Wellfleet has been looking at for the last 6 years or so include all of the things that Brian would recognize you'd want to look at. And when we started the process, the bulk of them were not allowable under regulation. So it took this 208 process to create an opportunity for communities to actually even look at certain of these alternatives. So that was a very, very big change that I think Wellfleet deserves some credit for in terms of initiating and seeing through. I think that's a real feather in our cap. So the beautiful thing is now the state and EPA have said, okay, you guys want to engage in some other things that we think make some sense based on the science and technology, have at it. It's up to you. And that's the relationship that the government has with each community is we've now given you a list of, say, 40 different things. You guys go figure out what makes most sense for your community. Look at the costs, look at the alternatives, look at the risks, and develop your own strategies and approaches. And, without putting words in DEP's mouth or the Cape Cod Commission's mouth, I think they're here to try to support whatever the community chooses as the appropriate path forward under this new guideline of a regulatory framework that's looking for certainty, that allows for adaptation over time if things you try don't work, to improve upon those, or to switch and try other things. So I think we've got a wonderful opportunity and a wonderful framework now that we worked really hard to develop. And so now we're at the point of, sort of hitting the crossroads of, okay, you've been looking at these different strategies for the last 5 or 6 years, and you've done some costing and analysis of those. Let's try to put them in the regulatory framework. Let's put them in the tools that the Cape Cod Commission has now gotten approved to be able to look at how they'll actually impact the watershed and begin getting serious about a management approach and also a regulatory approach that says if this doesn't work, how are you going to move forward with the next thing? How are you going to adapt this plan going forward so that ultimately the watershed sees the benefits of reduced nitrogen? And and I would kind of put this out there too as a question. I mean, from my perspective, sitting on the wastewater committee as I have these last few years, I've always looked at two major things for the town of Wellfleet. One is, how can we come up with a Chinese menu that looks at the low-hanging, lowest cost fruit for the town first, and move our way through the more expensive things as we try to achieve compliance? So, looking at the taxpayer and looking ultimately at the watershed itself. And it turns out, at least from my perspective, as we began to focus on some of the alternative approaches, they produce immediate watershed benefits and impacts. You see clearer water, you see immediate reductions in nitrogen in the water body, and I think from my standpoint, what I think the real goal is, the big picture goal, is ecosystem function. So at the end of the day, this is all about trying to restore an ecosystem that has come into dysfunction and move it back in the direction of function. And I think that would be kind of a fair assessment from everybody's standpoint of what we're really trying to do here. And so, Scott can start to talk more specifically about how we, take a big picture kind of set of ideas and start to reduce it into something that ultimately begins a discussion with the town on specifics, on specific strategies, on specific numbers, and then also ultimately how we're going to implement it within the town, and ultimately how we're going to get judged and make corrections and adjustments as we move forward.
So my name's Scott Horsley. I've been hired as a consultant for the town of Wellfleet to work with everybody at this table. Thank you.
Could you talk into a microphone?
Oh, sure. Again, Scott Horsley. I've been hired by the town of Wellfleet. It's not on. Okay, so we're okay. Okay, and I'm going to be working with the town to help take the next step towards some of the things we've talked about, specifically the targeted watershed management plan. As Brian mentioned, I was working along with Aaron and others here as part of the 208 process a few years ago. We had some public meetings in Wellfleet, and we talked about this long list of alternative approaches, which, as Kurt mentioned, I think the 208 process really opened up the opportunity to really look at a full range of alternatives, both what we call traditional sewering and non-traditional technologies. We talked about a lot of those here, and there's a lot of interest, and there's been some success in moving some of those forward. As Brian mentioned, more recently, the Mass Estuaries Project, or MEP, produced a report that provided specific targets, which we did not have 3 years ago when we were doing the 208 plan. So part of the process now is to update some of the planning work that was done as part of 208 so that it specifically addresses these MEP targets. We have specific targets to be reduced throughout this Wellfleet Harbor system and each of its sub-embayments. Overall, we need about a 31% reduction in nitrogen to meet those targets, but again, there are specific ones for each sub-embayment. And the MEP model will help us identify where those reductions need to take place. I also wanted to mention that, as Millie mentioned briefly, Pleasant Bay, just down the road here, is the first state watershed permit. So I think one of the possible goals is to, as she suggested, move towards a permit for Wellfleet Harbor. And what I'm planning to do over the next 6 or 8 months is help put together a document that really uses the Pleasant Bay watershed permit or the Pleasant Bay targeted watershed plan as a template, and take the same approach, which essentially identifies, goes through and documents all the work that's been done, not only in Wellfleet, but also some in Truro and Eastham, who share part of this watershed, and put together both traditional and non-traditional approaches that will meet the targets that are in this MEP report that came out last year. And the goal, as I think Brian said very well, the traditional plan is something we know will work, build sewers, but it tends to be expensive. Some of the non-traditional approaches, as Kurt mentioned, appear to be less expensive, so why not look at them first? And the way a targeted watershed plan and ultimately a watershed permit would work is that once we agree upon what those technologies are that are appropriate for the town of Wellfleet, we then put together a permit that has a time period where we try to move forward with some of the less expensive non-traditional technologies, but we have a backup plan in there to use traditional technologies to meet those targets in case the non-traditional technologies don't work as well as we think they might. So that's really what this document will identify and lay out in terms of a process. I'll just mention some of the technologies that we've looked at for this harbor that we're considering, and many have been mentioned, but certainly shellfish restoration, aquaculture is a technology that many towns in the Cape have looked at as one of the technologies. So that's on the list, and certainly there's been some advances here. Kurt mentioned the Mayo Creek and Herring Creek projects. Those are underway. They will have some water quality benefits. They're very hard to quantify, but once those projects move to construction, monitoring can help identify what improvements might be there, and then the way the system works, the way the watershed permit works is once you have the monitoring, then the town gets the credits towards the reductions required as part of the MEP project. So those projects are likely to have some benefit. We also have stormwater management on the list, trying to treat some of the runoff from the roadways, both Route 6 and some of the town roads that clearly go into the harbor. Fertilizer management is on the list. As part of 208, there's a sort of agreed upon temporary or interim credit of a 25% reduction of fertilizer credits if in fact the town can go forward and document that those actually occur. So that is on the list as well. And then the last one I have listed here is inlet modifications. We talked about a possible widening at the Duck Creek area to look at to improve the flushing in the area. It might also have some water quality benefits. So the purpose of this plan is to sort of lay out all these alternatives to provide whatever estimates of reduction that we might be able to achieve from each one of them, and again have the backup contingency plan there, and then submit that to DEP for approval. And ultimately, we would hope to get a watershed permit similar to what was issued for Pleasant Bay. And then that would include a detailed schedule of things that need to be done, including more detailed engineering studies, including construction of pilot projects, monitoring, et cetera, moving forward. So I'll stop there unless there are other questions or people want to add to that.
I think that's good for now, and if Andrew, you could speak about funding.
Sure. So I come at this from a bunch of different perspectives. I used to work with these guys. I used to work with Serrano at the county. And now, with APCC, so we're kind of independent on this. But I also have a municipal background. I'm on the board of selectmen in the town of Mashpee. So I'm dealing with this from my town's perspective. At the end of the day, it all comes down to money. And so there are a number of financial assistance programs that are available to towns that are struggling to deal with this issue. And with the money comes strings. So one of the important things for the town to decide how it wants to approach this, if you want to get the assistance, and there's a fairly deep level of subsidy that's now available through various state programs, which I'll touch on a little bit, you have to play by the rules. So that assistance comes with a cost, if you will. And the cost is complying with some of the requirements and planning necessities that come out of DEP. The statutes that provide this funding assistance have additional requirements associated with them under the premise that if the broader Commonwealth is providing an additional benefit to Cape Cod towns, and Cape Cod towns dealing with nutrient projects have access to funding that is not available to other communities throughout the state. So in exchange for that deeper degree of subsidy to help the Cape deal with its problems, Commonwealth's asking for certain things back in return. And so it's just important to kind of understand the context in which the Cape benefits from the money. It comes with certain additional requirements associated with it that it is utterly up to you whether you want to access. If you do, it'll save your community substantial amounts of capital in the form of foregone interest payments and principal forgiveness on debt. If you don't, there's certain things you don't have to do, but you're going to be paying for it on your nickel, and you're going to be paying interest on it on your own debt. You decide how you want to play that as a community. No one's forcing you to take the money. If you voluntarily take the money, you assume the obligations that come along with the money. So the primary way that the Commonwealth and the federal government support municipalities on wastewater treatment and management is through something called the State Revolving Loan Fund. It's a federally funded program where the feds give money to the states every year to run a revolving loan program. The idea behind it is they seed money, the states fund projects to address existing water quality problems. The towns pay that money back to the state. State takes what they got paid back, ships it out, gives it to the next program, next town that is ready to do work. So that's the structure under which all states operate now. It's a replacement of the old federal grants program where the feds would pay 90% of the cost of a facility. That changed in the Reagan years. And the state matches the amount of money that the feds put in on an 80-20 split. So if the feds give you $10 million, the state puts in another $2. Massachusetts runs a very aggressive program. They take the money that comes from the state, match it with the federal money, match it with the state money, and then they issue bonds, and they basically, by multiple of 3, increase the amount of money that's available to communities for loans. So Massachusetts runs now, I haven't looked for a while, probably like a $7 billion plus revolving loan fund program, right? The state, in addition, buys down the interest payment. So the conventional program across the Commonwealth loans money to communities at 2%. In today's low interest environment, that differential between 2% what you can borrow is not as great as it was when the program started. In those days, it was 8, 10, 12%. So that buy down was really significant. And they do that through an annual appropriation in the legislature every year as part of the state operating budget. So in addition to that, 11 years ago now, the Commonwealth recognized that the Cape had a problem that was beyond its financial means to deal with, and provided a zero interest provision for communities dealing with nitrogen management in the context of a 208 program. It was a code that basically meant Cape Cod. But if you go in the statute, you won't find any special provision. If you search for Cape Cod, you ain't going to find it. Okay? But that structure of that language was adopted in 2008 and has been repeated and built on in 2 or 3 subsequent major legislative pieces of work that have provided additional benefit to Cape Cod communities. In order to get the zero interest loan, there's 5 things you have to do. And I don't remember what all 5 are right now because I haven't looked at it for a few years. But the 2 really significant ones are you have to have a comprehensive wastewater management plan from DEP, and that's a prerequisite to getting any of this money. Any community in the state has to have a comprehensive wastewater management plan. The definition of that's been tweaked by DEP in the spirit of flexibility, given the 208 program, to come up with this surrogate, the targeted watershed plan. It's a way to meet the requirements of the statute and give the towns a break. Okay, so you have to have a CWMP or a targeted plan as a surrogate, and you have to get sign off by the Cape Cod Commission that the plan you're implementing is consistent with 208. There's some other stuff, it's not insignificant, but for the purposes of today's discussion, those are the 2 important things you need to remember. Initially, that zero interest provision was 10 years time limited as a failed attempt to try and encourage towns to move more quickly with the idea that the money's going to go away, so you got to jump on it. Well, none of us jumped on it. So the legislature moved the deadline out, actually provided some certainty and consistency with the time frame of the 208 plan, and has now statutorily said that the zero interest program will continue on through 2059, I believe. So the 50-year horizon of the 208 plan was adopted by the legislature for this program. So towns have some confidence that that zero interest money is going to be available over the long-term implementation program that typically reflected in most of the plans that towns are coming up with. So you've got the zero interest loans, but you got to jump through these 2 hoops to get it. 2 other things that were done of significance is that the legislature in 2016 adopted some statewide provisions that are important to the Cape that allow for forgiveness of up to 25% of the principal of an SRF loan. So the state can give you a loan, easy numbers, $10 million to a town, and give you 25% principal forgiveness. You're only paying back $7.5 million. So you take a $10 million loan, you're not paying any interest, so you're saving roughly the cost of the principal over 30 years, plus you're not having to pay back $2.5 million of that $7 million loan. So instead of paying back, in a $10 million loan over 30 years at 2%, you're gonna, your principal interest payment would be $20 million. Under this scenario, you pay back 7.5. Pretty good deal. You're not going to be able to do that on your own if you choose not to deal with the regulatory requirements. The other thing the legislature did was create something in the last year called the Cape and Islands Water Protection Trust Fund. That operates as a subsidiary to the state SRF program. And what I mean by that is it's separate money that can only be used to pay down the principal of SRF loans to Cape Cod towns. That's the only purpose they use for the money. So that money has started to be collected. They did 2 things. They created the trust fund, and they created the structure and said it's going to be used only for this purpose, to fund wastewater on Cape Cod, and it's managed by a 15-member local management board, or overseen by a local management board, 1 representative of each one of the 15 towns, all of which are participants by law in the trust fund, unless you choose to get out, in which case you can't access that additional money. And the state treasurer's office is prohibited from spending money for purposes other than what the statute calls for, and can't spend any money without the approval of this local trust fund board. So that's new money. The money started going into that trust fund July 1st of this year. And that's going to provide additional funding to buy down the principal payments on SRF debt. In order to access that money, the only way the state has to give it back to a community is if you've got an active SRF loan. So that trust fund is limited both in scope and purpose and in the way you can access the money. Commonwealth cannot, under the laws it's written today, write a check to a community for its so-called pro rata share of the proceeds. It can write a check to the community to pay off the principal associated with an SRF loan. So you have to be doing projects in order to access the money. Again, it's a hook into, it's a carrot and a stick. The carrot is there's money available. The stick is in order to get access to the carrot, you have to have put a project forward and gotten that funded. So those are, a significant number of ways that you have the ability to access. But again, because it relies on the SRF, and the SRF relies on compliance with the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan requirements, all roads lead back to, in this financial assistance world, all of them lead back to compliance with the regulation and your willingness as a community to incur the upfront cost of doing the plan and evaluation to a sufficient level of detail that they're happy with it in order to access the money. So those are, some ways the whole thing's tied together. The other thing, and it's a little off the money, but I want to put it out there, the legislation that created the watershed permit, again, used the same structure as the funding. You can't get a watershed permit anywhere else in Massachusetts other than Cape Cod. It is a tool that is applicable only on the Cape. And it provides and it recognizes the fact that the Cape is uniquely situated to want to use some alternatives in combination with some conventional wastewater treatment technologies. And the regulatory structure and the statutory laws that govern the regulations had no way to recognize the nitrogen reducing benefits of the alternatives until and unless this watershed permit thing came along. And so the value of the watershed permit is it gives you a way to get credit for alternative ways of reducing nitrogen that don't rely on a treatment plant. You don't have to have a watershed permit to engage in the activities you want to engage in. You do have to have a watershed permit, A, if you want to get credit for it, and B, if you want to be protected from litigation from third parties. So the value of the watershed permit, in my estimation, is less in the getting credit part and more in the fact that it lets you take a CWMP that by nature is going to have a 20 to 30 year implementation horizon for most towns. Get a permit for that, and once you're operating legally under a permit, even if you haven't achieved the water quality goals that are called for in the permit, but you're operating under your permit and you're current in your compliance with the permit terms, a third party like my organization can't come in and sue the town for non-compliance with the water quality standard. So the shield against litigation and the room that that gives you to implement a long-term plan is enormously important. It's an underutilized tool. It's an underappreciated tool, partly because it's new. But it's something you ought to seriously consider in terms of getting certainty about what you're going to do, having the time to do it, and getting the financial support that enables you to do it. But again, in order to get the watershed permit, you got to demonstrate CWMP compliance and you got to establish 208 compliance. So it comes with some obligations, but they're enormously important and valuable tools for you to consider how you want to go in order to control as much of your fate at the lowest actual cost to your taxpayers as you possibly can.
So Andrew mentioned 208 consistency. The commission is responsible for deeming plans 208 consistent if they want to access the SRF funds or the watershed permit. So historically, the commission would have reviewed wastewater, water quality management plans as a development of regional impact, and it would go through a regulatory review and consistency with our regional policy plan. It didn't make sense. Really, for this particular purpose, we needed a different approach, so it was a recommendation of the 208 plan that we transition to a consistency review. So this consistency review is a staff level review at the commission with an executive director sign off, and we've essentially distilled the 208 plan into 10 criteria that a local plan needs to meet in order to be deemed 208 consistent. So I'll just touch on those briefly. So the first is that the community assumes responsibility for the controllable nitrogen for any part of the watershed that's within its jurisdiction. As I mentioned before, many watersheds in our region are shared. Wellfleet Harbor happens to be roughly 85 or 90% within the town of Wellfleet, so it is shared, but it is mostly within your community. The plan put forward is estimated to meet applicable nutrient reduction targets. That the planning occurs at the watershed level with consideration of a hybrid approach. And so when we say a hybrid approach, we mean consideration of the alternatives that might be appropriate for your particular community. That the public was engaged to gain plan consensus. So we really promote public engagement and stakeholder engagement throughout the entire planning process so that when you get to the end, you've got the support you need to move it forward. That the plan includes proposed strategies to manage nitrogen loading from new growth. So the MEP report identifies the nitrogen load that needs to be removed at the time that the MEP report was completed and that the modeling was completed. Any new growth in the community within the watershed would need to be addressed as well. That the plan includes an adaptive management approach. So this is what Brian touched on earlier, that there's essentially a backup plan, that there are other strategies that you have thought through that if your first strategy or your first and second strategy don't work, that you've got another approach to move forward with. And that you're constantly evaluating the effectiveness of what you're implementing. That the plan includes both pre and post implementation monitoring. And so with a reliance on some of these non-traditional technologies or alternative approaches, we want to ensure that we are understanding can understand how effective they are. And so we would need the pre-monitoring and the post-monitoring plan in place. That the plan includes a description and an assessment of how the town proposes to fund the strategy. That the town commits to regular 208 plan update consistency reviews. So rather than signing off on a plan, kind of a one-time regulatory review, we'd rather be checking in with the community, and we're proposing at least every 5 years, unless we work with the community to identify a different time frame, but that there's regular check-ins to evaluate how the plan is being implemented and its effectiveness. And that finally, that the town seeks to collaborate with neighboring towns and areas that are shared, so in watersheds that are shared by more than one community.
Anyone else on the panel have something to say, or can we open it up to questions from the audience?
I would just leave it that every town and every watershed affected by the towns is different. We had some really good lessons learned from the Pleasant Bay experience with Brewster and Chatham, Harwich, and Orleans. Different communities had different strategies, and the good news there was that they came to the table very early to sort of identify what represented their community and their needs. In that case, the 4 communities actually had to work through an IMA process, an intermunicipal agreement process. They needed to share the credits. So there was that accounting that took place. Again, we had a very concentrated monthly, for a year's worth of monthly meetings, strategizing, carrying the ball to the next finish line until we got the job done. It was quite an aggressive schedule, but again, it was first in the Commonwealth. It got a lot of really positive attention and clearly sent a signal that there was responsiveness from the 4 communities. Mass DEP is here represented at the table and committed to work with each and every one of you. We're excited about it. We see a lot of opportunity. There's been a lot of really great work that has happened under the past and current leadership. And we look forward to capitalizing on every single report and knowledge that has been gained through the years, and basically best inform our Boston office as to what works for Wellfleet, whether it's regulatory changes or any other types of policy changes that need to be had, so that we can capture every single opportunity that comes your way. And we really appreciate the opportunity this afternoon, and we thank the town of Wellfleet and its leaders and everyone here for the opportunity to be here this afternoon.
Your bosses have questions.
So, I think this will address a lot of things. I would love to hear from everyone on the panel where we're at now and where we need to go. How's that for a short answer? And, you know, what do we, yeah, so start with where we're at now with our permit, with our monitoring, and what do we need?
I'll give a really brief response, and then Scott, you probably want to pick up on it. But so where we're at now, especially with respect to what Aaron just mentioned, we have been engaged in biweekly monitoring with the Provincetown Center for Coastal Studies. So we have a very good database on water quality, so pre-anything. And the other good thing about the monitoring that's been going on, especially with regard to the MEP report, is that a lot of the water quality data that was in the MEP report didn't reflect some changes that the town of Wellfleet was seeing. So in other words, the data was like from the 2005, 2000, and I think it's even back to 2003 timeframe. And so one of the big changes that's happened in Wellfleet is the amount of oyster production on commercial grants in the town between that time and now. So there's an area where we can actually get credit for our commercial industry as part of this overall program. So what you guys are doing right now is something that we can help reduce the overall targets that we might have to achieve. It's hugely valuable to the town, both financially in this sense, but obviously also in the sense of what it's meaning economically for our residents. So that's a huge plus that exists in this overall program. And so we have data. We have some very good data from some specific work that actually Andrew was helpful in funding through the Cape Cod Water Protection Collaborative, where we actually were doing very intensive monitoring on the oyster project. So we've got some good data there. And then we've, as time has gone on, the other big change is right now we're looking at an approved dredging project. And so dredging, the removal of those dredge spoils removes nitrogen from the harbor. And so we're actively looking at how we might be able to take advantage of and get nitrogen credits for what's going to be over 300,000 cubic yards of material. So again, another strategy to be able to reduce the cost and reduce the overall targets that's a quote-unquote alternative. So with that, I think in terms of where we were and what we've got for data, I think we're very solidly positioned. And then going forward, in terms of where Scott would think we would want to proceed, I leave it to you.
As I mentioned earlier, I'm anticipating a 6 to 8 month process starting essentially now, and we've already had a prior meeting with pretty much everybody at this table. And during that 6 to 8 months, I would be putting together this document called the Targeted Watershed Plan. It's going to be information that's going to come from the town of Wellfleet. Some decisions need to get made in terms of priorities and choices. So we'll be talking a lot about that. And there's also going to be some information and analyses coming from the Cape Cod Commission. Aaron's group, they have a lot of good tools and databases which we can use to provide the required information that goes into this plan. As I mentioned before, we're going to use the Pleasant Bay plan as a template because it's been through the process, it's been approved, so it makes sense to me to use that as an outline approach. And I've been through that, and I essentially can see where pretty much all the information is going to need to come from, but it will be in part information provided by the town. I've actually gone through and identified which sections of the report would have to come from the town, and some of the information from the Cape Cod Commission as well. And I believe DEP has offered to meet with us on a fairly regular basis to check in on the progress of that. So hopefully 6 to 8 months from now we'll have that document. that would then get formally submitted to DEP for consideration of a watershed permit. That's kind of my view of where we're at and where we're going over the next, let's say, 8 months.
Right, so I just want to clarify, the idea is really to start pulling together at least the information that exists in that repository, put it in one sort of plan moving forward. Some documentation DEP to this day hasn't seen, so that's why Scott is engaged with trying to pull everything together. And from our end, one of the pieces that we will be mainly focusing on is the contingency plan, which again warrants a backup plan, so that in the event that things like aquaculture or inlet out widening or the fertilizer management together do not get us to the MEP goals, the idea is to then have a backup plan that is financially sound and backed up by all the technology and everything we need to do, so that we remain at play with the permit requirements.
Can I put a finer point on the question, just to try to help the conversation along? Because I think what I heard you asking was, from what I've seen, as yet you don't have, and I know Scott's working towards it, a plan that would meet either the targeted or the comprehensive wastewater management threshold.
Right.
It's an open question in my mind, as I sit here today, whether the level of detail on that Plan B that Millie just described under the plan for the next 6 to 8 months is going to be sufficiently detailed about, high-level engineering, technologies, and location of disposal facility and treatment facility. Is that adequately incorporated into the scope in order to meet your requirements when the work's done in 6 to 8 months? That's an open question in my mind.
So that's the first meeting.
And-
What do we have and how compliant is it? And I think we definitely owe you a report back on that.
I thank you, because I would
I'm not in
reiterate.
government anymore, I can say stuff.
But I would reiterate that, because, with respect to any of the data that's currently being collected on any of the oyster projects or any other alternative approach, we haven't seen a plan of study for that. We haven't seen what the protocols are for data collection. We would need to be able to evaluate that to make sure it meets our quality control and assurance processes and procedures, so that we can actually accept those data in order to provide any level of credit. And I would also reiterate that with respect to the scope of work for the targeted watershed management plan, I think that's something that we want to work with the town in to make sure that all the tasks and the level of effort that is put into those tasks meets our requirements in order for us to accept a targeted watershed management plan that not only would qualify for SRF funding, but also would meet the Commission's 208 consistency requirements.
Kathleen?
Oh, thank you, Hillary. My question's for Scott, and there are 2 questions in this. Should you look at another alternative approach, what would be the time frame you'd need to quantify the data and the results to the town? We've looked at the oyster mitigation, we've seen that data. Another approach, another alternative approach, in your mind, what would the time frame be? And I'm just looking, because I'm asking this question because in the event we had to fast track something, going into another alternative, I want to know what that time frame is. Then I have another question.
Okay. Well, actually, a couple responses. First of all, the plan to quantify the potential benefits is to use the Cape Cod Commission's tools. They've developed, as part of the 208 plan, a technologies matrix, which then serves as the basis for another tool called the MVP planning tool. And we've already started working with, I've already started working with some of the Commission staff who have attempted to start to quantify the benefits of the traditional plan as was outlined in the prior work done by prior town consultants. And we do this, use the same tool to try to quantify the benefits of the alternative approaches. Now, if you're asking, and I read you a list of some of the things we've been considering, but if there are other, I certainly want to work with the town through the right process to get any input on what other alternatives might want to be considered in that plan. So the time frame would be over the next 6 to 8 months. In terms of turnaround time, the tool that we're using to attempt to quantify the benefits is pretty quick. I mean, it can be done, let's say, in a period of weeks once we know what the elements of the plan are.
Okay, second part is, I'm just speaking for myself personally, I feel that it would be irresponsible of the town not to have a contingency plan. Having said that, you as our consultant, I'm asking why we're not looking at regionalizing this situation with the towns of Eastham and possibly Truro. I know each town is different and each town has its separate needs and so on and so forth, but I look at this situation as more, the three towns together.
Well, the plan will, as several of us pointed out, the targeted watershed plan does include the whole watershed.
Right.
As Aaron mentioned, Eastham and Truro have relatively smaller parts of this watershed, both physically and also in terms of nitrogen load allocations. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think the numbers she mentioned are pretty close to, Walsh probably has 85 or 90% of it.
It's like 2% for Truro and 5% for Eastham.
But still,
But they will be part of the plan. So that will be included in the plan, and, Millie mentioned some of the work in Pleasant Bay. As part of that, and other discussions elsewhere in the Cape, there's consideration where some of these towns who have smaller roles that are further away from the harbor may even make a financial contribution towards the implementation of the plan rather than doing something in their own town. So there are a number of alternatives to how Truro and Eastham could participate, but we'll look at that as part of this planning process. I do want to go back, though, to some of the prior discussion, because in talking with Dan and Hillary about the work that I'm doing, I want to be clear that the work that I'm doing does not include any on-site investigations of the disposal sites or any engineering design. So that is, as has already been said here, that is, I guess, a little bit of an open question, what level of detail would be required ultimately by DEP to approve a watershed permit. Because I want to be clear that I'm not going to be providing that level of work, and what I'm doing is looking at what has been done and pulling that together in one document and then updating that work relative to the MEP targets and thresholds. I think we can certainly identify a collection area for sewering that would meet the amount of kilograms per year to meet the thresholds of DEP, and I can do that with the help of the Cape Cod Commission staff who have already committed to helping do that using their tools. There have been some past engineering work done by the town of Wellfleet that have identified some alternative sites, but just to be clear, to my knowledge, it has not been detailed hydrogeologic analysis on those sites, which ultimately would be required by DEP if that were to be permitted. I think the open question is, does that work need to be done now, or can some of that detailed site work be done as part of the watershed permit and plan? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I do want to clarify what I'm doing and what I'm not doing.
If I could just add a couple things. With respect to your question about evaluating the alternatives, the way that the watershed permit is structured is it's a 20-year permit, but we have encouraged the towns to look beyond 20 years as the design horizon in any planning that's done. So you can say look at it as a 40-year planning horizon. And the watershed permit implementation schedule is really broken up into about 5-year chunks, whereby you can look at different approaches within say any one of those 5-year periods in order to come up with a plan that we can look at and agree is an appropriate plan, collect data for at least 3 years, so we have some statistically significant database, and then be able to take that last year to evaluate those data and determine whether or not it's appropriate to afford the community the credit that is being asked. So you can do that, and you can do that in successive 5-year increments for the first 20 years, say for that first permit. And at that point, we'd have, along with ongoing monitoring to see what the response is within the system itself, and to see if that response is in fact sustainable. Then we would, over the next permit, look at whether or not we need to invoke the contingency plan or portion of that contingency plan in order to start meeting our final targets.
If I could just add one thing to that, I think this is an important point we're hitting on here, clarification. As part of the 208 plan, there is a section there that I think Aaron mentioned called adaptive management, which essentially becomes part of the permit. And it's in the way it has been envisioned so far, as Brian just mentioned, is in 5-year increments. And the graphic that I'm remembering, because we showed it many, many times during the 208 process, shows this 5-year period. And on the contingency plan part of it, it says design and permit during that first 5 years of the backup plan. So I guess that's, while on the non-traditional material, we see how well things are going, we develop further data, documentation, and then at the first 5-year increment, at least my understanding of it would be that DEP sits down and look with the town, with the Cape Cod Commission. We look at how much have we succeeded on stormwater, fertilizers, shellfish, aquaculture, all the things I mentioned, and whatever the town picks. And during that same time, there would be a commitment for the town to design and permit a backup plan. And in my view, that would be some of this detailed on-site work that would need to be done to do the design work.
But I gotta say, I think we're dancing around this issue.
Yes.
I know what my town went through at the level of investigation and engineering in order to get a CWMP approved. And while, yes, we have a watershed agreement with Barnstable and Sandwich that contemplates, they're not even through the planning process, either of those two communities. So, yeah, our agreement between the 5 of us, the 3 of us, says we expect in the first 5 years, Sandwich and Barnstable are going to catch up. They're going to do more detailed design and engineering work. We don't know a lot of things, so there's time involved. But I think the relevant question at hand, that if I were you guys, I'd want to know walking out of this room, is are you on track with what you're contracted to do now in order to have a product that's going to get you CWMP approval? And based on what I've seen in my community and what I've seen other communities have to do, my perception is that the amount of work that's going to be done on designing and doing initial investigation of the viability of sites for a treatment plant and a disposal location is not adequate in order to get through their process. That's my perception. I'm not working for them anymore, but that's what I see happening. We're kind of dancing around
I think
it.
I think that's why we're here.
So that's exactly why we're here.
That's why we're here.
I have a question.
I'm sorry, I had my hand up.
Can we just listen to Millie first, and then we'll...
Yes.
No, I just want to echo that. That's why we're here. And Andrew sort of described the suite of financial incentives that currently exist. We definitely want to encourage taking advantage of that, in addition to all of the loan forgiveness, 0% financing, et cetera, so long as there's a plan in place and compliance with a comprehensive plan that's also deemed adequate by the Cape Cod Commission. Part of the permit process that what we experienced with the Pleasant Bay community was involvement from the U.S. EPA in Region 1. So they have a number of grants and just free money and opportunities, pilot testing, monitoring. And so the idea is to bring that concentrated effort at the table to get over the big hurdle that, in my estimation, I think we've been, not for lack of trying to get there, and there's been a lot of good progress in terms of trying to understand the harbor, all the oyster propagation projects that have come to place. We want to see point blank, for once and for all, are they effective? If they are, how do we move the needle to the next level? So I think we are at a very important point right now to sort of just move forward, not dance around it, get to that decision point with regards to what lies next for the town of Wellfleet in terms of putting all the pieces together and coming up with a very proactive plan that gets us into also checking off the box with a responsive contingency plan. And again, I'm not saying that oysters are not responsive. What I'm trying to say is if they don't work because they have maxed out their capability to deal with the nitrogen, then what's next?
Can I just add just one quick thing, one quick thing, I'm sorry, but it has to do with specifically the treatment facility and engineering. There's really, so when we went through the analysis of looking for where you can site enough capacity for sewage treatment, the only thing that really exists in the town of Wellfleet right now is a transfer station. So in terms of hydrology, in terms of location, in terms of, whatever we might want to consider, the work has been done on that in terms of what the town has control over and is large enough to be able to handle a facility. So, with respect to what Andrew was saying, there's less uncertainty than there is certainty, and it's more around having, I think, numbers that DEP is comfortable with.
So,
Helen.
yes, I'm sorry to be so impatient, but my question is to Brian Dudley, and it has to do with a term you used earlier, and it's germane to what we're talking about now. So, as you know, as some of us know, the town has many, many different parts to it. And what's happening in the central district, or in certain areas around the ponds, which are in part, have real concerns about watershed pollution, right? You use the phrase entire town, and what I'd like to have is a little more clarification about our contingency plan, because piping the entire town, specifically if it goes to only one site, is also a liability, given the proximity of where a lot of those lines would be laid out to wetlands and other areas. So we have to have a contingency plan, right? There are areas in the town that really need to have some kind of contingency plan for sewer treatment. But the entire town, including areas of South Wellfleet, all of which have fully compliant Type 5 systems, and a lot of distance between them, and are far from any body of surface water. When you said entire town, please, in terms of our contingency plan, can you be a little more specific?
When I said entire town, what I meant was a plan that encompasses the entire town, because the entire town essentially is the watershed. They're basically one and the same in this particular instance. So what the plan does is look at the entire watershed or the town and apportion the different solutions that will meet the reduction targets in order to meet the target threshold for habitat restoration throughout the system. Now, if you look at the MEP report and you look at the different sub-embayments within the Wellfleet Harbor embayment itself, you'll see that there are different percentages of removal as envisioned by that particular model, or that particular model run, that will meet the target threshold. Now, that model run that was done as part of the MEP report is only one of an infinite variety of scenarios. And, part of looking at the effectiveness of these different scenarios is looking at, as a first cut, employing the MVP tool that Scott was mentioning that the Commission has developed. But that's not necessarily the only part of the modeling that has to be done, because if you are looking at something that differs significantly from what was modeled in the MEP report for your contingency plan, then we would have to take the further step of utilizing the MEP model, which involves more than just land use loading, but takes into account the hydrodynamics of the system in order to see if we are actually meeting the target threshold. And then what I would also say is with respect to conventional treatment, in large part does look at sewers and collection systems in a treatment plant, but it can also involve innovative Title V systems for nitrogen control if the amount of nitrogen to be removed is small enough that can be handled by those. But that's not a guarantee because we don't have that many IA systems that are approved for nitrogen removal. And, you know, the other thing is if you're looking at, you know, remote areas, there is a possibility of, you know, a community collection system to treatment that, you know, can look to achieve the target threshold. So there are ways of addressing a contingency plan that are sensitive to the geography of the town and that sort of thing. And then I would also just say that, you know, because a facility has a complying Title V system does not mean that it is meeting nitrogen reduction targets, because a conventional Title V system is not designed specifically for nitrogen removal.
Just Dana.
I have a question for Kurt and then Brian, if you have a comment. Where does the detailed sewer plan that Environmental Partners, it's my understanding, it did for the town, how does that fit into a contingency plan? It's not usable, or don't we have a fairly
It
detailed?
it is, and the question is whether the level of detail in that analysis is sufficient for DEP purposes.
Has Brian seen that plan?
We've had some discussions about it, but I think those discussions are still ongoing.
So it may or may not fit into the contingency plan?
Well, what I can say is
Yeah.
that from the 2014 plan that was submitted,
Yep.
well, actually not formally submitted, but was given to us for an informal review. My recollection was that it was significantly lacking in sufficient detail.
Didn't have specificity?
No. And I think that was one of our comments at the time that we sat down for an informal review of it. Would you agree, Hillary?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I think we have to be out of here for, I think, right, we have to be out of here? Or do we-
1:30.
So can I get some specifics on, I like steps. So what do we need to do this afternoon? What do we need to do in a month, 6 to 8 months? Where's the follow through? Maybe Hillary can lead it off. I don't know. What are the steps we also have to make sure we have money
Yes.
before we get funding. So, you know, that's one reason we're
Well,
here today too.
I think we're gonna work with Scott for the next 6 to 8 months and have an outline of how we're going to obtain the permit. I think it's clear that we need some more engineering work and hydrogeologic work for our contingency plan, which
And will-
requires money.
Will that be with,
That's not in Scott's contract.
that's what you're saying.
So that's another task we have to talk about and contract with someone to do. We would need to seek funding to construct or evaluate our alternatives. We need some public participation and public engagement, which is built into Scott's contract right now. So once we finish working with him, we have an outline. We're working with the Cape Cod Commission and DEP, you know, monthly along that trajectory. And then we know we need some more engineering work, so I think the wastewater committee would talk about that and how we would go forward with that. And then we see where we are at the end of the 6 to 8 month time period.
But
any other comments from the?
yeah, I would say before you get too heavily involved in this 6 to 8 month time period, that we should sit down as soon as possible
Right.
and look at the scope of work, exactly what the tasks are, and make a determination if we feel that this is going to be enough for a targeted watershed management plan to, you know, start pursuing the watershed permit, or if we should include other tasks within that scope,
So
And I
when
guess,
can we do that? Like, when are we
yeah,
looking
so-
for this?
whenever.
So permit or no permit, watershed permit or no watershed permit, Mass DEP is here. And we'd like to get started as soon as possible. I think at a minimum, we would like to take stock of the body of the work, identify any areas that need a little bit more, acknowledge the areas where you've done a lot or just what you need to do. We are committed to start this process, and it's at no additional pre-permitting fee. It's just simply Mass DEP reaching out, in consult with our partners and Cape Cod Commission, and Andrew helping out as he can, APCC, and helping us out. So akin to the process where we had with the Pleasant Bay Watershed, with the Alliance, just monthly meetings, calls when needed, a lot of back and forth, trying to at least be as efficient as possible.
Can I try and answer that? My take on that, if I could be so bold, is to give you guys as a board an assignment. You need to decide relatively soon what you want the endpoint to be. Do you want, as a board, do you want to come up with, and what I suggest you do want to come up with, is you want a locally driven planning process that results in an approvable, comprehensive, or targeted wastewater management plan, and you want to develop a financing plan that supports, identifies resources, revenue streams, and schedules things out in a rough sense. The funding stream that will support the implementation of whatever your plan comes up with. And that absent that, it's really hard to ask your staff to bounce around through this stuff because it's a freaking minefield. So if the board were to say, in relatively short, these are what our expectations are, it makes your life easier because you've now made a statement about what you want with some specificity. Those are the two things I think are the most critical ones for you to be able to proceed, and then give it to these guys and let them run with it, schedule the meetings that need to be scheduled.
Mike?
I guess it's a point of clarity, and I just want to make sure that I have this right. It sounds to me like before we can be approved for any watershed permit, that we have to have a detailed contingency plan that will traditionally proven technology that's all detailed and engineered with the treatment site, not obviously set up, but in the engineering, for us to be approved for any comprehensive treatment plan.
For the permit.
Yeah, or a watershed
Or at
permit.
least discussed that that would be the plan, but we need to understand what exactly is the traditional.
The DEP would not issue a watershed permit without that contingency plan that's acceptable.
In writing.
In writing, detailed,
Right.
engineered.
And for all we know, in 5 years, you've solved the problem.
Right.
And
We
you did not
backup
need to
plan.
invoke the contingency plan, but the contingency plan needs to be spelled out in the permit.
What I would say is the most critical element from an engineering standpoint is demonstrating that you have the capacity for disposal. The details of a collection system, the details of a treatment plant, the treatment scheme, the processes, all that sort of thing, that can be worked out as part of the overall permitting of the plant itself.
Later.
Later. But the critical element is making sure that you have disposal capacity. And I think that's where the focus would
I mean, in
be.
Mashpee, we have a map that shows 2 or 3 treatment plants, here, here, and here. We control the property. The disposal sites are here, here, and here. And, here's a general idea of what the sewer connections are gonna look like and where the pump stations are. We're just now, and we got that approved 5, 6 years ago now.
Yeah.
We're just now looking at going to town meeting in October to get the money to do the actual bid quality design specs. So there's a big difference between what Brian just described in terms of being able to demonstrate a reasonable likelihood that you could pull it off and having something that you'd hand to a contractor to go do a bid for and issue a contract on. You don't need that latter part now, or anywhere close to now. You need to just be able to demonstrate, this is where it's all gonna flow, we control it, and we can manage it here.
Just one more question real quickly. I was just wondering if the DEP has approved as an alternative method any sort of non-traditional collection sewage treatment facilities. I know in Falmouth they have something going on, and they've done some stuff in Burlington as well, where they're like ecological treatment facilities. And I'm just wondering if that's been applied for or looked into or.
Through the IA.
Some of those would be evaluated under the Innovative Alternative Program under Title V. And what went on in Falmouth really was that they were trying to establish a pilot program for things like composting toilets, gray water systems, urine diversion toilets, that sort of thing. They really weren't able to get a lot of traction on it because even though they were offering subsidies, there were very few takers. But that's not to say that the situation might be different here. But any of those kinds of approaches still would have to go through the IA approval process as specified in Title V.
Which we facilitate.
Or were you talking about
I was talking
alternative
about
treatment
collection
plants?
treatment plants.
He's talking about like the thing out in Ashland that
Like
the-
John Todd ecological.
yeah. I
stuff.
mean,
Oh, yeah,
The
that-
department's permitted 2 of them. I don't think either one of them's functioning anymore.
No.
Talking about maintenance, right?
Well, there were a whole host of issues. But,
They were permitted in the 80s, and then neither one is functioning any longer.
I mean, you really don't, I mean, in terms of a municipal treatment plant on that scale, you really don't see a lot of alternate designs anymore, quite honestly. But there is a fairly large suite of technologies that are applicable to larger scale municipal plants that should be evaluated because each one offers different benefits and risk.
I don't think in any case anybody's talking about, replicating a scale version of the high-end treatment plant with open aeration tanks and the like. I think the reason a lot of these alternatives have gone away is that in building small scale, very effective, high level treatment technologies have improved enough that the demand for them's gone away.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing. There's been a lot of confusion, this is to you, sir, about how you get credit for an oyster.
Mm-hmm.
Like, does it have to be harvested to get nitrogen credit for an oyster?
Well, the nitrogen that is taken up by the oyster has to be removed from the watershed.
Correct. What happens, see, our concern, and I'm with the Wealthy Shell Fishermen's Association,
Mhm.
and a bunch of aquaculture growers here, we are very skeptical about the oyster side of this,
Mhm.
and that's why we're all here today, because first of all, we don't think it'll work, because we already grow up to 10 million, I believe, or more oysters in Wealthy Harbor. And if oysters are gonna clean the water, they're already doing it. Another thing is, we have enough oysters on the market. It already gets flooded in the fall. If these oysters that you want to grow wind up on the market, it's going to hurt us. It's going to hurt our farms and hurt the prices of oysters. So we don't want them anywhere near the marketplace. They could be harvested, destroyed, or whatever has to happen to them. But that's our main concern.
Well, I think one point of clarification, we, as a DEP, are not necessarily advocating any
one way or
alternative approach, whether it's oysters, whether it's inlet widening, whether it's permeable reactive barriers. That is a local decision to be made. And if there are local concerns, as you expressed, with any program that may, then I think those are the kinds of things that need to be vetted through the public process that will develop this targeted watershed management plan. We are not advocating or encouraging any one particular approach.
Once they're out of the water, you don't care where they go, do you?
Well, I mean, there is a chance that they do get recycled through consumption, but essentially, yeah, if they are we want to make sure that, yeah, that they're not getting returned to the water per se to contribute, the nitrogen.
All right. I have basically one question, but it's for both the Cape Cod Commission and DEP. And that is, how do you view the Herring River Restoration Project in terms of nutrient load reduction?
I think from our perspective, we have not seen enough data to give you an answer on that, to quantify it. I think that is something that should be addressed as part of the targeted watershed management plan. I'm sorry I don't have a more definitive answer, but we just don't have the data to be able to make that determination.
But we will.
Same? Yeah, okay.
And that's a secondary, I mean, that's not the primary purpose of that particular project. I agree with Brian, we'd have to see. That's the very reason why we suggest a pre and post monitoring effort, if you want credit.
Hold on one moment, I just want to make sure. Ryan, did you have 2 questions or just
No,
that?
just that for right now, I think.
Okay, Helen?
Yes, so I just want to be clear. At what point, given that we're in this process, there is a consultant that's being contacted, and other boards and committees are already working on this, and here we are at this meeting. At what point can we start asking for funds from the state for this? Does the plan have to be accepted already before we can start, asking for funds from these 2 sources?
You can get a 0% SRF loan for the planning process,
Which is what we're doing now.
which is what you're doing now. There's an annual solicitation process. It's probably underway now.
That's huge.
That runs under relatively tight deadlines, so you might want to look at that.
Right.
That would potentially fund you for January 1st going forward.
So Andrew's affirming that that process is at play right now.
Right.
So another point that's important, we have an answer to that here, who's our shellfish expert, who has an enormous amount of data about what's in the harbor now, what's being harvested, and there would be a good way to get a really decent ballpark as to what's going on right now. In other words, shellfish is not the magic bullet, but it certainly contributes to what's going on and has for some time. So I'm introducing her to Mr. Horsley, if you haven't met already, and her database is awesome.
Great.
It's mostly from the state.
Great.
Janet?
Hi, first of all, I want to thank Brian for sending the email saying, please prepare a burning question, and I do have one. And it is,
That was Millie's idea.
on the uniformity and universality of the monitoring process that either makes or breaks getting the permit. Is there uniformity across all the watersheds in how you measure the nitrogen and at start and during the whole process?
So the quick
And the science
answer
behind it.
from my end is there are mathematical approaches to getting there, but this would be potentially our second watershed permit. The first one issued by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts DEP was a couple of years ago. It's available. We'd be more than happy to share that. It's a public
But I
document.
mean, the monitoring process, is it peer reviewed? Is it scientifically studied so that it's, we're sure that
Correct.
it's-
So
Yeah, any
you have
mon,
an accurate
yeah.
starting point to say this
Yes.
is where you need to go?
Yeah, any monitoring that is done has to be done under a quality assurance project
I
plan
heard you say
that would have to be, developed. And it certainly can be appropriated from other, from other already approved QAPs, but it would have to be tailored specifically to your,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to take just 3 more questions because I know some of our panelists have to get going and get on the road. Ginny?
Just for clarification purposes, we've all been told several times that our watershed permit was being fast-tracked and was imminent. And would you just, so from what I've heard today, that doesn't sound like we're being fast-tracked, that we might actually be some ways away. And would you say we're in a fast track for it?
Well, I think the message is that we have a very good opportunity now. That to me is the message that DEP wants to leave you with. We have a dedicated team here, Drew Osei, who we just hired, and he's an expert in these types of things. So we want to capitalize on the continuity of the team. Brian Dudley, who's worked across, up and down the Cape for so many years. I believe quite strongly that Wellfleet is ready to go in terms of a lot of information, a lot of questions that are responsive to our environmental agenda. And so you're looking at us, the dedicated team here, to help you. Are we coming down with an enforcement posture? No.
No, I'm more concerned about the issuance of the actual permit. If you were to put a
Well,
timeframe
even
on
the
that.
permit is an option. You can continue to work without the permit, but I think we enumerated a number of advantages as to why the permit might be something that it's.
But as of yet, we haven't even submitted a
No.
plan.
Exactly.
So
It's still at
there's
the
nothing under review
infancy
or
stages.
approved or-
We're talking about it, we're thinking about it. We can provide you with a sample permit, the only one that we've issued so far, so you can familiarize yourself with it.
Okay, thank you.
Nick?
Yes, I was going to ask about the role of the Board of Health as far as addressing wastewater. Other specific measures we could take now that would accelerate the process in any way as far as obtaining nitrogen credits, suppose we were to get rid of all those cesspools in town. Is there any specific approach to wastewater now that might move the process along? I mean, we're spending so much time, as you mentioned, with the Title V. From my perspective on the Board of Health, putting Title V along Commercial Street, how beneficial are these things really being? I mean, we're squeezing these systems into these lots
Yeah.
that are right on the water. So the whole notion of how that's going to help, I hold my breath when we vote for these things. That's sort of where we are
Yeah.
in many of the places around town, especially Duck Creek, which is the worst part of town. So we just been through this, where people come in with 12, 15 variances. What can we do? So we try
Yeah.
to squeeze these systems in, and we're in a quandary because
I
you leave the meeting and you say, did we really improve anything?
well, I mean,
And to some extent we have. We say, we hold our nose and say it's
Yeah.
better than what was here. So, that whole Commercial Street area, we're spinning on wheels to some extent.
yeah, I mean, if I were you, I'd be holding my nose too. But, but I think, but the thing is, and, it's a quandary, but, you're now moving forward and committed to coming up with a plan. And, there have been other communities that have felt that, the answer to, an immediate solution is to impose some sort of nitrogen restrictions or require IA systems for nitrogen removal. And I've always advised caution against that as a knee-jerk reaction, because the reality is that, particularly in the downtown area, the level that you need to address that is not going to be satisfied by an IA system. And what you end up doing is forcing somebody, particularly in a repair situation, to spend a lot of money that may, that likely is just going to fly out the window if, a more conventional sewering approach comes down the road, and you lose support that way.
Those will be the people that will lead the opposition to whatever plan you put forward at town meeting, because you made them pay through the nose to do the IA, and then you tell them they gotta rip it out and connect to the sewer and pay twice.
Jude, go ahead.
We spent an hour and a half saying how Wellfleet basically was not ready in so many ways. It was told in 2014 it needed a contingency plan, and here we are 5 years later still without one. So Millie, what's your title? Because I don't understand why we're number 2. Barnstable's much further along than we are. Yarmouth, why Wellfleet? And furthermore, the jurisdiction over making these decisions now involving Eastham and Truro, how is that going to work out?
So a couple
That's a
things.
big question.
Sure, so a couple things. Our posture, as I explained right now, is not to impose a watershed permit to the town of Wellfleet. That's not the idea. Well, I think I am basically offering the opportunity for us to come together. And if it turns out to be a watershed permit that gives you the space and time to figure things out
Time.
with enforcement forbearance,
Time
why-
is what we need.
right, so that's afforded through the permit. And in fact,
So we
it's.
don't need to be number 2 in the guinea pig.
Right. You don't
There's
need to
so
be, you don't need to be
many
number 2 or number 10. Basically, you need to be where you need to be in terms of compliance.
Okay, well, as long as you leave this meeting thinking that we're not number 2, that's great.
That's fine. I think, you know,
Yes, I think that's important.
sure. So we're here to
Slow
basically
down.
slow down. I'm sorry, I'm not capturing what you're,
This is the public engagement, first opportunity we've had lately. Our group hasn't met since December, it's hard to get minutes. So this is a requirement, as you stated, by whatever group you're from.
from the
We're
environmental
failing
protection.
in Wellfleet in that this meeting was not announced, you know, well, so there's lots of things. So we
Okay,
need to
so I
slow
think,
down.
no worries. So I think the idea here is to at least leave, all of us leave here with a common goal, which is environmental protection and compliance. If we agree on that, I think we've met the goal of the meeting.
Okay, we're a long way.
I think we're going to take one final question.
Yes, it's kind of 2 parts. One question I have is, from what I can understand, all of this discussion going back is predicated on human sources of nitrogen loading, if I'm not mistaken. What is going to happen if we implement these various solutions up to and including the installation of sewage treatment plants at huge expense, and we find that we are not addressing the problem due to non-human sources of nitrogen loading, and I point to the 70,000 plus seals in our waters, a significant percentage of which are in the bay and even in our harbor, and which produce prodigious amounts of wastes in any given 24-hour period. My second question is, why is it that with this meeting having been in the planning stages for as long as it was, that it was left to a member of our community to notify us that this was going to happen this afternoon? There was no...
Last night.
Yeah, last night to be specific. And what part of the open meeting law was not complied with in this respect? Why are there a handful of local shellfish people here as a result of this lack of notification? This affects all of us. And the expense that is likely to be incurred is going to make it much harder for many of us to continue living here. I think we are owed an opportunity to be here and to weigh in on this and to ask questions. And we were not given that opportunity. I'm pretty upset about that. And I'd like to hear a plausible explanation if possible.
Helen?
Yes, so I agree with you. The select board wanted this kind of meeting to happen, and this is the first of many. There was some confusion about the time, and it was inadvertent. In other words, there was, by the way, it fell between the cracks, and it was addressed as soon as people were aware of it. But I'm hoping, as one member of the select board, that we'll have a further discussion about the information we've gotten. And it's important that there was some outreach to people on different boards and committees within the shellfish community. But what's important is the information we got from this panel of people who are not from the town and who managed to come today. And this is thanks to our health conservation agent, who was able to organize it at the request of the select board some meetings ago, which she stated previously. But to go back to what I already said, in my opinion, this is just one of many communication, information sharing meetings where a lot more questions can be answered. I'm not making noise here. This is what I think we need. And one of the things that was really cool about today was Mia Baumgarten, who takes videos of a lot of our meetings, was able to show up, and this is going to be on the town website. And I think we should all do outreach and let people know that so they can watch it and get back to the select board and ramp up communication between different groups about this process. The time is now to do that. Does that seem to you?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
And if I could address your first question about looking at human sources versus other sources. the MEP did not specifically go out and count seals or, count the specific seal load. However, part of the modeling for nitrogen loading is looking at the nitrogen contribution from the sediments within the system. And those sediments come from a variety of sources. It's the settling of plankton, and it would include waste from birds, from mammals. So while, and I'll be honest, it is not necessarily a completely accurate assessment, but it's a beginning for an assessment, and it does give us some idea of the magnitude of contribution, or actually, in some cases, the actual removal of nitrogen from the sediments themselves. So it has been addressed to some degree.
And we do stand to remove quite a bit of that sediment in the coming 2 or 3 years as we dredge the harbor.
Right, and
I'm on the Marine Advisory.
Right, and I think that's something, as part of your further planning, that you can look to address to see if in fact we can provide some credit for that.
People tend to get hung up on the level of precision around the numbers. And the reality is that over time, these systems are going to respond somewhat differently to what the model suggests. There's lots of changes going on in the environment. Seal populations are dynamic. Climate issues are changing. The thing to focus on is sort of the directional approach that you want to go. You've got a long period of time over which you're going to be solving this problem, and the permit provides you an opportunity to adjust according to the response of the system. So if you're worried, I would say, don't worry about the last third. Which is where a lot of the, getting that last third is where a lot of the money gets spent, because the cheaper stuff has already been put in play. You got enough of the cheaper stuff over a long enough period of time to decide that you have a problem, accept that you have a problem, you need to begin to deal with it, choose your management suite, and get started. The system that's been created around this, while it sounds bureaucratic, and in some respects it is, it's also really flexible, and it gives you the opportunity to adjust your program as the environment responds to what you're doing. And if you reach your water quality goal long before the plan predicted that you would, you get to stop. So you're not locked into, the whole exposure might be X tens of millions of dollars and we have to spend every dime of it, or we're not in compliance. The water quality drives whether you're in compliance or not. So if you do things early, get them done, and it works, and things work for you, you get to stop. Conversely, if you do everything that's in your plan, and it didn't work because maybe you didn't account for the seal load, or because water temperatures have risen over the 30 years, then you got to do more. And I don't know how many of us are going to be around when that question rises, but don't let that uncertainty prevent you from starting, because you'll never find out where that break point is until you start.
Well, I get that. It's just my concern is that if we do all that, and we spend the money that we stand to spend on this, due to forces beyond any of our ability to control, it comes to, we're still not in compliance. This area has become less and less affordable as time has gone on, and I'm concerned about.
Let me give you an alternative scenario to consider. Because you don't do anything because of that concern, and there's ongoing litigation out there, and the history of litigation under the Federal Clean Water Act is judges like treatment plants. They like treatment plants because they can go stick a sample bottle at the end of the pipe and determine, somebody can report back to the judge, it complies or doesn't comply. Sewering everything under a federal court order is the most expensive, unaffordable, non-consistent with your community character option you can get. And so you got to weigh, and pick the path that, in this scenario, is less bad for you.
So we're
But
certainly-
doing nothing leaves you really hanging out there. And as other towns begin to move, the weaker members of the herd become a little bit easier to pick off by the third-party litigants that are already out there and have declared their intentions. Just another thing to think about.
I think we circle back to the notion that the time is now, and that we still have some flexibility that's available, and we should avail ourselves to that flexibility. Again, Mass DEP remains committed to working with each and every one of you, and it's really been a pleasure to be here today. We really thank you for the opportunity and look forward to a very solid partnership where we can bring about the resources that are needed to solve the problem together.
Thank you. It sounds like you would allow I know I'll agree, allow the shellfish community to work with our constable to come up with Wellfleet's own plan as far as how to manage these oyster restoration reefs that would be part of the plan. I know in Monty's Pond, they had an outside contractor that had to be hired to come in. I think Wellfleet would like to see self-management happening here and not outsiders come in to manage this. So is that something that the DEP would allow us to manage if we had science to back it
Well,
up?
we have, isn't CCM part of that, or marine fisheries?
yeah, I mean-
We have our state partners, so they can definitely be part of the fold, and again, it's what defines the community too, as,
Because that's where some of the fear is coming from,
Yep.
with the people that live here today, is that.
There's room for everybody.
We work closely with a lot of the fishermen and who've been actively involved in.
we have a better plan when it represents the needs of the community, so we welcome that.
And the town's never done anything with regard to shellfish that wasn't basically working through the Shellfish Advisory Board and through
We haven't heard from
through
you
town
at all,
channels.
so we don't have to go
Um,
down that path, I don't want to open that door. But thank you guys, you've been fantastic and you've answered a lot of our questions, so good to know enough in the past.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you guys for coming.